You can be what you wanna be if you do what you gotta do. It all happens at Hilary's house, where all you gotta be is you. Hey everyone, and welcome to Hilary's house. Last week, I spoke with Zanzi about all of the different ways in which African cultures have been retained and alchemized throughout the history of the African diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean. This week, I'm talking with Reverend Ashley.temin about her unlikely or perhaps unspeakable boundary crossing of growing up in an Irish Catholic family and becoming a Protestant minister. Like last week's discussion, this discussion happened before the death of George Floyd. This last weekend, Reverend Ash was asked to offer a sermon in reflection of Christianity's complicity with white supremacy, colonialism, and racism. She shared it with me, and she's given me permission to share this really special piece of work with you. So I wanted to introduce her, my very, very dear friend, who I met at the Irish School of Ecumenics at Trinity College Dublin, by sharing with you some of her beautiful, eloquent, and poignant words. This is a sermon to the people of Hope Central Church in the neighborhood of Jamaica Plain in Boston, Massachusetts, delivered by Ashley.temin on Christianity's complicity and the work of true discipleship. Matthew 28:16-20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." When I was in my teens, if you'd asked me my favorite Bible verse, I would probably have quoted you this passage from Matthew, at least the last line. I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. Truthfully, growing up Catholic, I didn't have much fluency with the Bible, but I loved the comfort of that last line, imagining Jesus standing by me through thick and thin. Also, when I was growing up, once or twice a year, there were missionary priests who came to talk to the congregation about their work, usually in Africa, bringing food and essential services and the good word of the Lord to the people of those poor communities. It went without saying that the people in those communities were Black and brown people. You only had to look at the pictures on the sides of the appeal boxes to see that. We were encouraged to sacrifice our allowance money to help feed and educate those other poor people who couldn't help themselves. It felt uncomfortable, but I couldn't at the time have told you why. And so when I read this gospel passage again earlier this week, I wasn't thinking of comfort. I was thinking of colonization and injustice. I think a lot of us came to Hope Central because we wanted a place that was welcoming in ways in which the traditions we came out of were not. A place we could be ourselves. We wanted a place that walked the talk of equity, that forefronted justice, and also, I think it's time for us to reckon with the fact that we as Christians are part of a long, long legacy of condoning white supremacy implicitly and explicitly. Because this is not just about personal repentance or about the good work we're already doing here, though those matter, but about recognizing and acknowledging the racist histories of our institutions. We can start with this passage from Matthew, a passage which has been used to spearhead the kind of evangelization that went hand in hand with colonization. When the white European empire wanted to justify its spread out into the lands of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, it did so with a cross held high in front of its armies, arguing that its purpose was the salvation of souls in those places which were too uncivilized to be Christian as yet. If there was gold or aluminum or wood or other natural resources to be had, those were the reward for the salvation of the souls of the inhabitants of those lands. White Christianity, drunk on the power it held within empire, marched forth to claim souls and to exert power in the guise of salvation. In this country, from its inception, Christian theology has been used to justify first the looting of lands from the indigenous populations and then the installation and perpetuation of a slavery society, one which continues on today. As theologian M. Sean Copeland writes, quote, "The Christianity preached to the enslaved peoples was a peculiar amalgam of texts and admonitions that sanctioned perpetual servitude and bent black bodies and souls to the profit of the slaveholders," end quote. White Christianity, in the guise of substitutionary atonement theology, honed in on the idea of redemptive suffering as a way of keeping the other, people of color, women, queer folks, in a place of subjugation. When you're fed on the lie that your suffering in the here and now doesn't matter, or worse, that it's holy because you'll be rewarded for your faith in heaven, then abuse and marginalization are normalized into something sacred. The abuser is just helping you to salvation. As Rebecca Parker and Rita Nakashima Brock have argued in their book, Proverbs of Ashes, such theology bears a direct responsibility for the silencing of abuse and the perpetuation of violence in communities of faith. And as our own Reverend Ben Perkins reminded us in his Easter sermon a couple of months ago, quoting Chiese-le-Mont, "Evil loves tomorrow because peddling impossibility is what abusers do." White supremacy loves tomorrow because tomorrow undercuts the need for justice right now, the need for action today. We cannot ignore the fact that Scripture has been used as a whip, as a noose. And if we are to call ourselves Christians, no matter how progressive we are, I think we must grapple with that legacy. Christianity, as it's been practiced by the powerful, has made the people being assaulted and abused into the sinners, rather than recognizing that the system itself is the sin. We might say, we are not those kinds of Christians, but this is part of our spiritual ancestry, those of us who are white, those of us who have been shaped by Christianity. There is healing to be had, but only if we grapple with the harsh truths that we carry and which white Christianity has forced black bodies to carry. As James Cone writes, quote, "There are no degrees of human freedom or human dignity," end quote. We are all free or no one is free. What Christianity can be and has been, as Cone argues in Black Theology and Black Power, is a religion of protest against the suffering and affliction of the human and religion of liberation. A religion which takes seriously the message of Jesus against empire, against the oppression of any group, and particularly in this country, against the false promises and twisted power of white supremacy. What this requires of us white people, I believe, is recognition, repentance, and reparations. Recognition of our complicity in systems of domination, in perpetuating the abusive narrative of redemptive suffering to people of color. Repentance of that complicity, grieving, educating ourselves, feeling the guilt and shame that arises but not getting mired in it to the point of stagnation, and the active working for justice and righting of the wrongs done through concrete acts of reparations. And also, I think, rewriting. The gospel has been rewritten, if not in words, then in intention, weaponized and used to prop up the power of the oppressors. If Jesus is preaching the freedom of the poor and the outcast, if he is demanding the upending of the dominant power narrative, if that is the message which he is asking his disciples to spread to all the nations, not as an imposition of power, but as a template for freedom, then that is the gospel message I want to proclaim. Not one which divides and conquers, but one which makes whole through the active practice of justice. I would not call myself a Christian nor have answered the calling to Christian ministry if I did not believe in the gospel message as one of good news. That good news has way too often been narrowed and codified into a script for domination. But Jesus was not a white man, nor was he a powerful man by the metrics of his society. What he was a disruptor, a speaker of truth to power, a radical instrument of God's love and justice. White supremacy and empire have recast Christianity in their own image. that Christianity has forced an internalized colonialism on people of color. But there are other Christianities from which we can learn and build. There is liberation to be had from our own shame and sorrow so that we may do the work of dismantling racism in our own tradition and our own hearts, so that we can do the work I believe we are called to do, the work of reparations and the mending of the world. The liberation of Christ is a liberation from being an oppressor as well as from being oppressed. And this work is not new. There is a rich tradition of Black theologians, liberation theologians, communities, churches critically examining the power structures of Christianity. We are not alone in this, and there are so many from whom and with whom we can continue to learn. And finally, I want to say that though this work is not easy, it can be joyful. The more we strip away the oppression that has infiltrated Christian theology and practice, the more we get down to the truth and the radical liberation of Jesus' message. A discovery of a God whose love is wild, unfathomable, and boundary-breaking for all. And that is a church of which I want to be a part. Amen. As always, I hope that you're all taking very, very good care of yourselves right now, taking care of those you love, and thank you so much for coming to Hilary's house. Have a great week, everyone. Hi.
Oh, there we are.
Reverend Temin.
Dr. Booker.
How are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's so nice to see your face and talk to you.
And amazing earrings you are wearing.
JJ and Holly got these for me.
Well done, JJ and Holly. Yeah.
I asked you if you would be willing to share a poem today, and I was wondering if you were able to select one.
I have this one by an Irish poet, Yvonne Boland, who speaks really profoundly to connection to place and to ancestry, and particularly to women's place in Irish history. And she's been one of my favorite poets for a long time, and she actually passed away very recently. And so I thought I would read a poem from her.
That's good. That's what I was hoping you would do.
So this poem is called I went to find the grave of my grandmother, who died before my time, and hers. I searched among marsh grass and granite and single headstones, and smashed lettering, and archangel wings, and found none. For once I said, I will face this landscape and look at it as she was looked upon. Unloved because unknown, unknown because unnamed. Glass pistol castle disappeared, ball tray and then claw her head. To the west, the estuary of the Boyne, stripped of its battles and history, became only willow trees and distances. I drove back in the half-light of late summer on anonymous roads on my journey home as the constellations rose overhead, some of them twisted into women. Pinioned and winged and single-handedly holding high the dome and curve and horizon of today and tomorrow. All the ships looking up to them, all the compasses made true by them, all the night skies named for their sorrow.
Thank you. Do you want to offer any reflections on that poem, or do you want to leave it as it is?
I guess I will say that I came across that poem first, I think, when I was writing the thesis for my Master of Divinity degree, which was a sort of creative project. I wanted to examine the story of my grandmother and my mother and myself with some creative pieces interwoven with some more academic theology. And that poem spoke to me very deeply because my grandmother, who is Irish, and my mom was born and raised in Ireland, and my grandmother I didn't know very well. Like, she was in my life, and I spent a lot of summers at her house in Ireland, and also, like, she remained this sort of enigmatic figure to me, who I had these like pieces of memory of her doing certain things or being a certain way. But I realized in working on that project that I really didn't know her at all, and she had been long dead at the point that I started writing it. And a lot of it was about imagining her life and imagining who she was based on these little snippets that I knew or had experienced, and particularly her life and experience as an Irish woman who was born in 1918 and died in 1998, and just the experience over that time as a woman and as a part of this country that was becoming a nation and becoming independent. And so this poem, I think there's something in the words, something in the cadence of it that is very evocative of that, my own relationship with my own grandmother. And so it's stayed with me for these intervening years and is still very powerful to me.
Are you familiar with the Hebrew Jewish practice of midrash?
I am, yeah.
Would you say that that practice was almost like a midrash of your, rather than looking at a scripture and trying to move through that process through a scripture, your grandmother's life? It was a text.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely, that's a beautiful way of putting it. And I do think that's true. And I think poetry has a way of allowing those access points that it's sort of like the secret way in to things that are unknown. I think it's Richard Rohr who says that poetry is the last true theological language. And I think that that's really beautiful, right? Because it's all about holding the mystery and not looking for concrete answers. But I think, as with Midrash, like, I'm bringing in my own experience, I'm bringing in my own resonances to this sort of relational practice with a text, or this person who's become a sort of text to me, and that these surprising things sort of emerge in that process.
I love that. What is your first memory of poetry?
Oh gosh, I think starting in maybe like 6th grade, we had to like learn certain poems and recite certain poems. But
Right.
I remember in 8th grade, I had this amazing English teacher, Mr. Mayer, Dan Mayer, and he was phenomenal. And I remember he had an Emily Dickinson poem on his wall. It was like, hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. And I remember that very specifically. But I also remember that that year we spent a lot of time we were reading, I can't remember if it was the Iliad or the Odyssey. I think it was the Odyssey. And I'm sure we were only reading like small sections of it, right? But with his teaching, it became a really living thing. And I remember reading Shakespeare in his class. I think we read Romeo and Juliet maybe, or something. And it was the first time anyone had ever told me that, like, Shakespeare was written to be performed, right? It wasn't written to be read silently. It was written to be acted and imbued with all the emotion that you imbue things with when you speak them out loud. And you could argue that Shakespeare is poetry, but I think maybe those formative years when I was sort of like 13, 14, that's when I started to be aware of the power of language and how poetry seemed to capture emotions in a way that other writing didn't necessarily capture. Which is why I think when I write myself, even though I don't really write poetry per se, I think it's always my goal to make it sound like poetry, to write prose that sounds poetic and beautiful.
You're definitely one of the most poetic, eloquent, sophisticated, beautiful writers that I personally know, for sure.
Thank you.
You write a lot of different things.
Mm.
What is the favorite type of writing that you're doing right now?
I really enjoy generally writing sermons, which is something that I didn't ever anticipate that I would write or deliver, in fact. But it's a lovely sort of bounded medium. And it's a lovely challenge, I find, because often, at least in Christian churches, you're preaching from a text. And a lot of churches, including the one that I'm a part of, you use the common lectionary readings unless there's a specific reason not to. And so sometimes you're landed with a biblical passage that you're like, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with this. But I've found it to be a really delightful kind of process of diving in and sort of finding your way through the text and swimming in it a little bit, and then trying to create something around that, or that's infused by that but not limited to it, that it takes the text as a jumping off point or as a theme, and then it expands into something that's hopefully resonant for the people that you're writing for, preaching to. And also I'm finding, particularly right now in this sort of like strange pandemic time, that having a specific touchstone and a specific sort of specific parameters for what I'm writing is really helpful to me. And so like a sermon, you're generally working with, maybe 1,000 words or 2,000 words, or like there's a specific amount that you're thinking about. And so it makes it a little easier to train myself into those boundaries, I think, than if I'm just writing something open-ended, which is also a lovely process, but it's different.
Yeah. Do you feel like a sermon is also a performative genre?
Well, I would say it can be performative. I strive to make it more relational than performative, to make it more of a conversation between myself and the congregation that I'm preaching to. And that's an interesting experience. I think it's easier when you know the congregation really well, or you know the audience really well, because there's already a relational aspect built in, and there's a sense of like, the space, the physical space when we gathered physically, which isn't happening right now, or you have this way of seeing people on the screen. It's a little more challenging when you're, say, guest preaching in a congregation where you're not as familiar with the folks, or where you're kind of coming in with a particular sermon or idea that may or may not land the way you anticipate that it's going to land. It's interesting because in the church of which I'm a part, we stand, when we're in the physical space, we stand on the same level, like quite close to the pews. Like there is an old place up high on the altar where I'm sure a pulpit that's like way above everybody else. We never use it, but I guest preached at a church back in February, another old New England church, and they do, like, the person leading worship, or the ministers, is quite like high up and set apart from everyone, and it definitely lends a different experience to the sermon. So I think it's interesting because the words are living words, I think, and they respond to the space and the energy and the people. And so I think that's another reason why I am enjoying sermon writing so much in these moments, just because you sort of never know what's going to happen, which I think is true with anything you write that you put out in the world, right? Like people will read it and respond to it in whatever ways. But with sermons, you sort of get it in real time.
Right.
The response, you get the facial reactions and the people's responses, which can be a little nerve-wracking, but it's also can be very exciting.
Yeah. Can you talk about a time when offering a sermon was especially powerful for you as the giver of the sermon?
I think they're all powerful in their own ways. I preached a sermon in late December, I think, and it was the Feast of the Holy Family. And it was a really powerful experience for me because I was preaching on this feast day with which I was very familiar from my childhood and growing up Catholic and having all of these sort of resonances and remembering all of the devotion to the Holy Family and the statues and the imagery, and I was preaching it in a Protestant church that is not so oriented towards the idea of religious feast days and things like that. I mean, they exist, but it's in a different sort of register. And so I think it could have been an experience that was quite dissonant because of that, but actually it felt really lovely. It felt like a sort of integration, incorporation of a lot of different aspects of myself. And also, I think just like that time of the year when it's between Christmas and New Year's and there's a lot of energy up and down all over the place and people are kind of, I think, seeking something quiet and contemplative, which is what I really work to include in my sermons, or to like I think I write all my sermons in a spirit of sort of contemplation and wanting to weave in a sense of interiority, a sense of quiet, an ability to be present to something, sort of indwelling of God in each of us. And that seemed, it all sort of came together in that sermon, I think. And I loved writing it and I loved preaching it. And yeah, it was a really lovely experience.
That's fantastic. You talked about how you grew up Catholic and now you are a minister in a Protestant church. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and that transition? Was it something that went from today I'm Catholic and the next day I'm Protestant, or what happened? What happened?
What happened? It's a great question. Well, it probably won't surprise you to hear that it was a long and winding path with a lot of detours. You know, I was raised very Catholic. I was very Irish Catholic and very devoted to it. And it was like very, very important in my formation and in my beliefs. And I went to college and I was involved in the Catholic student ministry, and I was really deeply devoted to it in a lot of ways. And then, as I think happens to a lot of people in college, but maybe later for me than for many people, I sort of started to think about it a little more deeply and ask some questions that didn't have easy answers. In my final semester of my undergrad, I took a class. I was a religious studies minor, and I took a class on Jewish feminism. And it was a seminar. There were 12 of us. We were all women. I think 10 of them were Jewish. And it was really fascinating. It really sort of cracked my world open in a way that nothing had yet before, because there were these women who were asking a lot of questions about, like, what is my place in a patriarchal religious tradition? What does this mean for how I believe, how I express myself, how I live a faith that I love, but it doesn't feel like it loves me back. So that started a whole long journey for me. You know, I graduated from college. I traveled around a bit. I went back to Colorado, which is where my parents had moved when I went to college, and ended up working for a Catholic church there for a couple of years. And that was a really profound experience because I was exposed to so many theologians and ideas that I never knew existed, right? Like Richard Rohr and Joan Chittister and Thomas Keating and all these people who were very devoted Catholics, but who are also asking a lot of big questions and not afraid to open these conversations. And so then I decided I needed to study ecumenical theology, which is how I ended up in Dublin and how I met you. Then there was like this long spate of years where I was like, I wasn't going to church of any sort, but I felt very deeply in relationship with God, Spirit. I started a PhD in theology, and then I quit because I was just like not being fed by that. And then I went to divinity school and came out on the other side, still not entirely sure what I was doing, religiously speaking. And then I had this experience about a year after I graduated from divinity school. I was in San Francisco. I was actually in San Francisco for a Buddhist Peace Fellowship conference because I'd been, I wouldn't say dabbling, but I'd been learning, flirting, being in practice with Buddhism for a while. But I was in Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, which is an Episcopal cathedral, and there's a labyrinth in the floor, which is an exact
Film or
replica.
Sarah Miles attends?
I think it might be, yeah.
I'm pretty sure it is, yeah.
And the labyrinth is a replica of the one in Chartres in France. And so I was like walking the labyrinth, and it was so not contemplative, right? Because there's tourists everywhere and they're like walking through the labyrinth and have no sense of what it is or why people are walking it. But I felt like everything in me go quiet, and I felt this sense of like a gossamer veil kind of falling over my head and shoulders. And I heard very clearly the word ordination. And I was like, well, that's funny. Because at the time I wasn't attending church, and I like obviously couldn't be ordained as a woman in the Catholic Church. And so, but I knew that it would, if it was true and it felt true, that it wasn't going to go away, that it was going to come out and manifest in some capacity. And so about a year after that, a little more than a year after that, I was feeling very lacking in spiritual community. And it was Advent, it was the beginning of Advent. I decided to go church shopping.
And where were you living at the time?
I was living in Boston, yeah. I had stayed in Boston after divinity school. And gotten married to a Massachusetts person, native. And I went, the first Sunday of Advent, I went to a UU church, and I just was very aware from the service that like I needed more Jesus in my life.
Yeah.
Which surprised me. And then the second Sunday, I went to this church, Hope Central Church, which is in a neighborhood of Boston called Jamaica Plain. And I had heard about it a lot in divinity school. People had mentioned it. Friends had attended during our time in divinity school, but I'd never been in. And then when I walked in the door, it was just like I knew that it was home, and that it was a powerful place, and that it was going to be a huge part of my journey. And so I started going, and I like cried every Sunday for the first like 3 months.
What denomination is Hope Central?
So it is both United Church of Christ and Disciples of Christ, which are sort of sister denominations. They're both congregational denominations. So I started going, I started getting more involved, and maybe about a year after that, I went in to talk to the pastor, Laura Ruth, about something. I can't even remember what. And we got to the end of the conversation, and she said, I really thought you were coming to talk about ordination. And I hadn't ever said anything to her. I hadn't really said anything to anyone. And so that really kicked off the whole process. And so I entered the discernment for ordination process, and I ended up here. And I think to go back to your original question, like it doesn't feel to me like I've left Catholicism. I feel like I've just expanded out to include more things. But the resonances of that, the rituals, are still part of me. And I think one of the reasons why I love Hope Central so much is that those things are welcome and incorporated. You know, we do communion every Sunday. We do, in a lot of ways, it feels to me a lot like a Catholic Mass, but very different at the same time. And so to me, it feels like a natural sort of progression or belonging journey rather than a like, I'm leaving this thing and I'm joining this thing, you know. It all kind of flowed.
I love that, an expansion.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the ethos of Hope Central? Because it seems to have, in my very brief experience, felt what you had described to me, a very decided and particular ethos in terms of inclusion and acceptance, and again, a very expansive kind of energy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's very much a deeply welcoming place. I think it tends to be a place where a lot of people who have been cast out of other places wind up because they didn't fit because of their race or gender expression or sexuality or some, you know, whatever the case may be. And so Hope Central is a place that we really try to be as radically inclusive as we can be in all the ways. And that I think that there are a lot of churches that say that and probably really want to be that, but don't do the work of being that. And at Hope Central, I found that people are willing to do the work to be present to the ways that we're contributing to systems of inequity and to work to repair, not just to sort of pay lip service to it. Ruth always says our standard of excellence is learning, meaning like nobody ever expects perfection. Like we put our hearts and souls and labors into the work that we do, but there's not an expectation that imperfection means failure. You know, like it's not a performative space, it is a relational space. And it just feels like a community where people really love each other and really accept each other. And I've wondered sometimes, like, how did this happen? Because it was this way when I showed up, but it had been this way for a long time and continues to be this way. And it's not all peace and joy and understanding. Like there's definitely times of challenge and differing opinions, and obviously like there's a lot of work in getting everybody to be aligned, I guess, or finding the alignment that works for everyone or most people. I think the joy and the challenge of the congregational model is that there is no church hierarchy and there is no like word from on high that this is how you do things, which can feel very liberating to someone who, like myself, who comes out of a very patriarchal, hierarchical church. But it also means that we have to create our own structures and our own systems of accountability and make sure that we're doing right by the people that we serve.
You mentioned that a critical moment in your spiritual formation was your Jewish feminism class. And you also have roots in Judaism, correct?
Mm-hmm, I do, yeah. My grandfather on my dad's side, who died before I was born, came from a Russian Jewish immigrant family.
Do you think that there's some level of that experience and that tradition that informs your practice as well?
Yeah, I think so. There have been times in my life when I've felt more explicitly connected to that. And so tomorrow I'm co-preaching with another of the associate pastors on a passage from Job. And as I was looking at it, I was thinking about the whole like rich tradition of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and how I think a lot of Christians tend to sort of like skip that part or not give it as much attention. But it's really like pretty extraordinary, and also the traditions that come out of it, like as you were saying earlier, midrash. And I think one thing that has taken me a really long time to learn, but I'm trying to embrace more and more, is this, and I think it exists a lot in Judaism, but is the asking of the question, like asking questions about everything, challenging everything, debating everything. And I'm not like a naturally vocal or conflict oriented person, but I do think there's great value in treating it as a living text rather than as something that was sort of set in stone many thousands of years ago. And I love the Jewish emphasis on ritual. So I think it's there. It doesn't feel like I'm deeply immersed in it right now in a conscious way, but I think also, it informs what I'm doing in probably a lot of ways that I'm not aware of even.
Are there other systems that you would say do or have influenced your practice now as a minister, or that you're hoping to incorporate into your practice as a minister?
5 or 6 years ago, I did a training certification program in Ayurvedic health. I think at the time I was doing it like from a very fear-based kind of place. I had these sort of physical things that I was dealing with, and I thought, well, this is going to fix those things. I had started working with an Ayurvedic practitioner a few years beforehand, and had like a really wonderful journey with her. And so I decided to do this thing, and it was an interesting time, and one that was really rich. And in a lot of ways, actually, I feel like there were seeds planted at the time, which I'm only just now beginning to see or understand. And I think there's a lot of beauty in the practices, beauty in the idea of our understanding that our bodies and our souls and our minds have these rhythms that are naturally part of the rhythms of the whole ecology of the planet. And that it's when we lose the sense of those rhythms, when we lose touch with those rhythms, that we experience dis-ease, whatever that manifests as. I don't take it as a sense of like, oh, well, you can cure anything that's wrong with you. Like, obviously there's a lot of external factors in our world that we don't have control over, but I do think Ayurveda has a lot of resonance with, particularly, I think the monastic practices in Christianity, which I always felt really connected to. And so I'm wanting to connect those more and more, both for myself and also for the folks who I work with, because there is this idea of like the daily offices, so like certain prayers at certain times of day, and a very specific rhythm
In the
to the
monastic
day.
tradition, right?
In the monastic tradition, yeah. But then in Ayurveda, there's dinacharya, which are the daily rituals, like the daily practices that you do at certain times during the day. And they're very much embodied practices. So there's a lot of focus on the digestion and the different systems in the body, and what's more active at what time of day, and what to do to sort of nourish that. And I think there's a lot of beautiful potential in marrying those two systems, because I think modern Christianity, at least right now, we've we have pulled far away from the embodied sense of spirituality. I think there's a lot of return happening, but for me, it's a very powerful thing to integrate those systems into something that is just not all that complicated. It's just like a way of living each day that feels like it nourishes the body and the mind and the spirit all together.
Where do you see the return happening?
I think there's a lot of longing for it. I see particularly I was going to say people around my age and younger, but actually I see it in all ages, really. I have a dear friend in Maine who's part of the Forest Church movement. And I know you've been involved in Nature Church, and I think that there's this burgeoning understanding that to experience God or spirit or divine in nature, outdoors, in wild places, even if it's just your garden, that's not counter to the church experience. It's actually something that can be deeply folded into a church experience, however you define that. And to me, that's a part of this coming back to the body, is to understand how we're connected to each other, how we're connected to the world around us, how we're nourished by being in a forest or being by the ocean or being in a garden, and understanding that that nourishment is not separate from our spirituality, but is intrinsically linked to our spirituality and is infusing our spirituality. To me, that's very exciting. And I see, and maybe it's just the circles that I'm in, but I see a lot of that longing and a lot of that manifesting.
Yeah. So kind of Christianity is more of an embodied experience than it has been more recently.
Yeah. And I don't think that that's the vast majority of Christianity, but I think there's enough of it that it's really starting to feel like a cohesive thing.
Do you think that that particular idea of both embodiment, Christianity as embodied practice, and also generally a more of an orientation towards ecology and nature and the cosmic Christ are areas for ecumenical opportunities?
Yeah, definitely. I think if anything that they're more universal experiences than our individual church experiences are, because we all have a body and we all experience that body in some way. And I think that the unfortunately quite pervasive experience of Christianity for the last however many centuries has been that the body is bad and the body is sinful and the body needs to be controlled. That's not just in Catholicism, that's in all of Christianity, and so particularly women's bodies. And so I think there's a lot of beautiful opportunity ecumenically across denominations to be fostering this different understanding of the body, of bodies in general, of the earth's body, of the way that we're connected and the way that those bodies are infused with the divine. They're not temples of iniquity.
So if you had to create a theology of the body, what would your theology of the body include? If you had like 3 points.
Oh man. Oh, good question. I would say that the body is holy. Every body is holy. That every body is a conduit for the divine. And that the interconnections of all bodies are a manifestation of the divine. I don't know if that's 3 points or if that's all
great.
the same
That's
point.
awesome.
It seems like all the same point, but yeah.
Well, in real life, often all of the points in a particular theory
Are the same.
interconnected or the same, so it's okay.
Okay.
This is real life theory.
Real-time theology.
Rather than theory, the real life edition, it's real life, the theoretical edition.
Yeah, I love that.
Speaking of ecumenics and ecumenical experiences, can you talk about how your experience at the Irish School of Ecumenics at Trinity College Dublin has influenced your experience and has influenced your ministry? And also, can you talk a little bit about what you studied there? Because the Irish School of Ecumenics is certainly a very expansive place, and the definition of ecumenics that the ISE has embodied has been greater than most kind of traditional ecumenical studies programs. So it was more of an emphasis on relationship and dialogue between all religions and all spiritual systems, not just within Christianity, even though that was the foundation of how it was started and why it was started. Can you talk a little bit about some of your primary studies there, and also, again, how those are influencing how they inform your practice now?
I mean, the ISE is just like an incredible place with incredible people, and it's difficult to, I think it's sort of impossible to overstate the degree to which it has shaped me and led me to where I am now. It really just opened up a whole world to me in terms of what you're talking about, of this capacity for theology to touch all these different aspects of our lives and to speak really deeply to things that matter. So when I was there, initially I did a master's in ecumenical studies, which now has a different name. And the program was like 10 people, I think. Like, there were not very many of us. And it was in Via House, which was part of the old Milltown Institute. So there's like a bunch of old priests next door. And as you know, all of this, because this is where we spent many, many, many hours together.
Drinking a lot of tea.
And so civilized, you know, you'd have a 2-hour lecture and there'd be a 15-minute
civilized
in the middle. It was amazing. So I think the culture of the place shaped me as much as what I was studying. You know, there was just this real sense of a deep hospitality and a deep delight in the work. And to me, hospitality and delight, I mean, that's what ecumenical studies should be all about. And so I took a number of classes. I would say like the most profound for me, I took a class with John May, an amazing man, on Buddhism and Buddhist Christian dialogue, which was, at the time, was for me really deeply resonant, because I had come from Colorado, where at the St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass is where Thomas Keating drew together this sort of interfaith Buddhist monk, Christian monk dialogue. And so I had been sort of steeped in that. But I ended up writing my thesis on ecofeminist theology and the idea of suffering. Ecofeminism was just like this thing that blew me out of the water. I mean, I didn't know it existed. And then all of a sudden I was finding Sally McFaig and Rosemary Radford Ruther and all of these women, powerful women, who were writing about women and women's bodies and ecology and the ways in which our theology has shaped our understanding of life on earth and life with earth, and seeking to break down the ways in which that has been pretty deeply flawed and detrimental, at least post-Enlightenment. So that really threw me on a trajectory. And I think I'm still on that trajectory. You know, I don't know that without reading those theologians in that space, that I would have come to the point where I'm, a minister, where I'm thinking really deeply about all of these things, and trying to continually integrate them into my own life and into the work that I do. And I mean, there's so much to say about the ISC. It was just like, it was an amazing experience, and I miss it all the time. And I think it's a pretty remarkable place. And I think it also holds a deep place for me because it's an institute, a group of people who have tried for a very long time to do the real work of reconciliation and bringing justice and understanding to, particularly to the north of Ireland. And I feel like I'm in this sort of very strange, very lovely, very disconcerting position of having been raised very deeply rooted in Irish Catholicism and now being a Protestant minister. And that's just like, that's a boundary crossing that is
Unspeakable almost.
Yeah, it flares a lot of deep ancestral energy, and I think perhaps I would not have been able to do without my experience at the ISC.
Do you think your transition from being from identifying as an Irish Catholic to your identity now, which you already said again, you don't feel like it really was a transition from I'm not this anymore and I am this now, this expansion, this ability to hold both things, because really you are holding all of whom you are. You shared with me recently that you have returned to a rosary devotion.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the monastic tradition and how to incorporate the monastic tradition, which is very Catholic and very Irish Catholic too, because a lot of the monastic traditions are the lineages which maintained mystical traditions, and often the lineages which maintained the nature-based traditions. And that's often where the Celtic lineage and the Celtic spirituality was in many ways saved or alchemized in some forms through the monastic tradition, particularly as it existed and exists in Ireland. So do you feel that this expansion, this holding both sides, is a form of ancestral healing?
Yeah, I do. It's been an interesting journey, and it continues to be an interesting journey in that respect for a long time. And even still, to a certain degree, I had this sense of betrayal, right? That like to become a minister in a tradition that my family for generations and generations would have seen as the enemy, even though the Disciples of Christ is an American denomination. That has been a very uncomfortable thing for me to be with, to feel a calling, to know that I could not fulfill that calling in the Catholic Church, but also knowing that it's a political divide that has religious clothing on it, right? That it's much more about class and privilege and history and oppression than it is about the actual religious beliefs. And so I've come to this place, and it's an evolving journey, but to say that I have this unique position as a woman living in the time and the place that I'm living in. I have the opportunity to be ordained. I have the opportunity to serve in leadership, to be a spiritual leader, to be recognized and named as such. And that I like to think that in their cores, my female ancestors my grandmother and my great grandmother and be back further, that they would, not just that they would be proud, but more that I get to manifest something which maybe would have been their longing if they had lived in a different time and place. And so not to see this as something that divides me from them, but to see it as something that connects me more deeply to them, and to Ireland in general.
You were talking earlier about your MDiv thesis and how it was both a creative and a theological exploration of the relationship between you and your mom and your grandmother. If you could talk about or name one thread that binds you together, what would it be?
I mean, I do think it would be our spirituality. I think the very beginning of that thesis, I start with an image of my grandmother, and my mom would take my sister and I to Ireland every summer when I was growing up, and we would stay in my grandparents', like, they had this huge old stone house and big old garden, and all my aunts and uncles and cousins would converge, and it would just be like spilling out with people all summer. But I would remember that when we would leave to go to the airport to go back to Texas, my grandmother would be out there with the holy water, and she'd be like flinging it on the hood of the car and saying all the prayers. And I don't have a real sense of what her beliefs were, like what her experience of God was, if it was all rote and fear-based, or if there was some expansiveness to it. But it was certainly a force that shaped her life in very profound ways. And also my mom, I mean, she's very, very devoted to Catholicism, and very, like, that is the thing that sustains her. And her spiritual devotion is really beautiful. And we've butted heads over it a lot in the last 20 years as I've explored and changed. But I think things are, we're at the point where we talk about it a lot more, and where we have respect for each other's beliefs and practices. And I'm certain that I wouldn't be here today doing what I'm doing if not for their faith as well. Even though that faith on the surface looks different, but I don't know that it's that different deep down.
Do you think that's kind of always true when we're talking about the evolution of people and families and lineages, whether they're ancestral lineages, whether they're philosophical lineages, whether theoretical lineages, that one of the things I've been thinking about a lot the last few days is how, given a lot of the theory that I have studied and I have explored and I have written, and where it's positioned and where it sits within the larger landscape of political theory and political philosophy, there can be in that realm some, well, there's a lot of anger, right? in that particular realm, there can be a ton of anger. And although I tend to be more in the reconciliation, reconciling, integration, diversity, how do we make this happen? Even though integration is inherently a violent process, why is it important to go through anyway? And how do we do it anyway? Because the violence is happening regardless, the intermixing is, all of it's happening regardless of what else happens. There's going to be suffering, so how do we find the mosaic on the other side of with the brokenness? But I've been thinking a lot about, well, these theories that seem so radical now, will they seem so radical in 10 years? It's easy to, for example, I mean, one of the things that comes up a lot, is the Constitution still relevant? Things like this. Or, is John Locke relevant to this time? Is Goethe still, is Kant still relevant to this particular time? But in their times, they too were radical. and those still are radical, but the theory evolves, and as humans and as societies, hopefully we're evolving. Unfortunately, sometimes the philosophies evolve more quickly than the systems that they're meant to be informing and influencing. But and again, with families, it's kind of always the kids are going to be like, well, my parents were, you know, but almost always there's it's clear where the thing came from, because we can only evolve so quickly. We can only evolve so much at a time. That's never linear either.
No, and I think it's to our detriment I think it's a natural thing when we're sort of teenagers and young adults to be like, I'm completely different. I do not belong to
right. Individuation is critical.
Yes. But then hopefully we return to this sense of, I've been birthed by, both figuratively and literally, by this family, and I carry the energies of loss and beauty and function and dysfunction and all of the things that have been woven into that, to this particular tapestry. And I think it also makes powerful the ability to transform ancestral systems, right, and to heal those things by healing them in oneself, because that connection is, I think, exists outside of linear time. And so you can reach back and you can reach forward, and there's a sense of being able to transform things that have been passed on for a long time, sometimes for many, many generations.
There's this sort of thread, this theme in a lot of your academic work around the idea of suffering, sort of suffering and depression. And in your practice, your interest is in doing grief work, which in many ways is one approach to healing or managing or working through, moving with experiences of suffering. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And I was also wondering if you could talk about, as somebody who's been embedded in this landscape of suffering, in this landscape of grief, literally and figuratively, because I definitely think that to a certain extent, Ireland is a place where grief and suffering live in the land and live in the landscape. The landscape is very alive there. I believe every single place has its own spirit, and every single place has its own energy and energetic composition. And Ireland's just very alive, right? It really feels like it has a beating heart and pumping blood, and it's sweating and crying and all of that. And that also very much seems like it comes out culturally. So to me, there's a little bit of, I think, of a correspondence between that experience and kind of your embodied experience of that and the work that you've chosen to do. But I was wondering if you could speak to suffering and grief and this particular moment, and what you see, how you see this moment fitting into those processes, because those are also very important processes. Those are, again, these transformative processes. Those are also processes of reconciliation, whether it's reconciling with oneself, with God, with other people, with one's ancestors, one's family, whatever. Can you speak a little bit to that?
I think fundamentally, I would say that suffering comes out of unexpressed grief or ungrieved grief. And there's so much of that happens in individuals and families and societies, and then gets transmitted onward. And in this particular society, or from my perspective in it as a white American woman in my late 30s, we've really cauterized the ability to grieve publicly and openly and in a way that is healing. I think, we've privatized grief, like we've privatized so many other
I
things.
love that.
It's like there are very small spaces emotionally and physically and time-wise, temporally, where grief is permissible. And there are very certain, specific, limited ways in which it's acceptable to express grief. But grief is wild, right? Like, I think it's primal. It's something that wants to be wailed and screamed and raged. And I have much respect for Elizabeth Kubler-Ross or whoever did the 5 stages of grief, but like, do we have to parse everything into like neat stages? And it just doesn't work. And it works to a certain point, but it's got its limits. And I think anyone who's experienced grief in a deep way will tell you that it's not linear and that it ebbs and flows. And I think particularly griefs are relational with each other, in that you can go through a period of grief around one particular event or loss and have a healing process around it, and then years later another grief will trigger that original grief, and you'll have this sort of re-experience of it. And I don't think that that's something to be pathologized. I think that that's a natural process. What is maybe pathological is our inability to accept that and our fear of it. And so I came to an interest, or a calling, I would say, in doing grief work because of my own profound experience of grief. And then also, as part of my ordination process, I was required to do a unit of what's called clinical pastoral education, which is a chaplaincy training. And most programs are in hospitals, which is what I did. I did it in a hospital, and sitting with a lot of people who were grieving and seeing the sort of vast difference between people who accepted that they were grieving and people who were grieving but were not accepting it, and the difference that it made in physically, emotionally, spiritually for folks. I really feel the desire and the need to help create spaces where it's possible for people to grieve in whatever ways feel healing and cleansing to them. I think our religious traditions have some really beautiful ritual around that. We've sort of closed them in and made them small, but the idea of ritual times of grieving and sitting Shiva in Judaism, and this sense of mourning through ritual, which is, I think, very essential to us as human beings, to have rituals for mourning. And I think one of the great losses of this particular American culture right now is that we don't have those rituals, and so people don't know how to grieve. They don't, other than to feel.
And they don't have the space to grieve.
Yeah, it's like, people expect you to have take a week off work and then come back and be fine. What I hope is happening right now is that people are recognizing that grief is so powerful, it has to be reckoned with, and that we're all grieving in our own ways. Even if we're not grieving the loss of a particular person, a loved one, we're grieving the loss of ways of life, the loss of jobs. I've been interested, particularly since before this pandemic began, in grief around climate change and grief that people, because I really see in myself and in others just this profound grief at a world that is changing, at places being lost, at species being lost, at degradation, at the loss of this sense of hope that our future was going to be brighter than our parents and our children's was going to be brighter than ours, and I think that ties in really deeply with this pandemic time. And I think that in order for us to come out of this, in whatever way we come out of it, and to be able to have a deeper capacity to be healthy humans on a healthy planet, which is, I think, what most of us hope for, then we have to grieve. The only way out is through when it comes to grief. You really have to give it space and you have to let it work you. I think I'll quote Richard Rohr again, who says, what we don't transform, we will transmit, So if we don't give our grief the space and the time and the attention, the ritual to transform, then it's just going to get cast down and onward as suffering. And I think also to acknowledge the collective nature of it, that we may on the surface be grieving different things individually, but we're all part of this great ecosystem and organism, and that we're grieving things that are greater than what we can even understand on an individual basis. And so, I think a lot of people are afraid of grief. Like, I've certainly been afraid of grief and have moments when I'm afraid of it still, because it's not usually a pleasant experience, but it is a transformative one, and it is one that is very essential, I think, to being able to be healing humans in a healing society and a healing world.
You mentioned that a few things that you think are essential for people to move through grief are time, space, ritual, being willing to work it. If somebody is watching this and they're grieving something, whether it's the loss of a person, the loss of a pet, the loss of a home, the loss of a job, whatever it is, people could be grieving so many things, the loss of an ecosystem. What advice would you give them in terms of how to go about creating those things for themselves?
I think in as much as you can share with other people in your life who are sympathetic, who may not be experiencing the same grief, but who have an understanding of what grief feels like, and have the capacity to hold that with you. One thing that I've really found tremendously powerful is creating rituals for myself, and they can be shared. I think it's powerful when you can share them with other people. But so for me, I feel very drawn to the ocean, and I feel a deep spiritual connection to the ocean. And so I usually do my rituals on a beach. And I think that you can create a ritual that feels resonant. Mine usually involve poetry and sometimes song and sometimes letters to those who have been lost, either through death or in some other way. And always a period of time to let go. And I've had various experiences with this. Like, I've had some experiences where it's like very powerful and very clear and very sudden. The letting go is done, and there's like, that's it. It's over. Not that the grief is necessarily done, but that there's like a very different quality to it after that. And then I've had experiences with ritual where it's like you do it and then it's like, okay, it doesn't really feel like anything happened.
It didn't work.
Yes. Other than I just like did this thing and marked this time. But I think it continues to work on you as you work on it. And so I think the most important thing is just to feel like you can release in some way that feels good and healing to you. And whether that's writing poetry and burning it, or like writing intentions and burning them, or writing someone's name in the sand by the seashore and watching the waves wash it away, or building an altar out of stones and sticks. You know, there's so many different ways of doing it. Or just like going somewhere that you love and weeping as much as you need to weep. But I do think that there's something very powerful in carving out a time and a space and an intentional way of being in that time and space to say, like, this is time that I'm using to be with my grief, to listen to what it's teaching me, to let go or begin the letting go process for this thing, which will always be a part of me. I mean, I think grief is not like a tumor. You don't just like cut it out and throw it away. It's in your bones. Like, it will be with you for the rest of your life in some way. But it won't, I think if we give it the time and the space and the attention, it becomes something beautiful over time rather than becoming a sort of solidified thing, calcified thing that we carry around like a weight inside of us.
What's on the other side of our collective grief?
Oh, I think resilience. I think suppleness. I think a way of relationship that is expansive. You know, I think I speak for myself and my own experiences to say it, like, it's very easy with grief to turn inward and harden because it feels so tender and so uncontrollable inside. I think we try and like build this armor around us, and particularly if we don't feel that we have safe spaces in which to mourn, then, you know, that armor becomes kind of essential for survival. So if we can find a way to collectively hold each other in the process, the healing process, then that armor becomes less and less useful and less necessary. And I think it frees up a whole lot of energy and possibility for all of us.
I love that idea of, if you can let somebody hold you, then you can take your armor off.
Mm.
I think about how many people are walking around with armor and do calcify and solidify and don't allow themselves to be held. And that experience of, you know, maybe there wasn't ever a time where it was safe for them to be held, but how much different would the world be? I mean, this is a lot of the discussions right now are about this reawakening of the divine feminine and this transition towards the balance between the feminine and the masculine, calling more feminine energy in. And I think this is a lot of it around receptivity. How do we allow ourselves to receive? Is it safe to receive? But I love the idea of people laying down their armor and allowing themselves to be held.
Yeah,
it's a really beautiful image. And people taking off their armor and for the first time being able to also hold, you know, because it goes both ways. It's kind of hard to hold someone if you have armor on, just, you know. so both ways, to both hold and be held, that the armor prevents that. And in the absence of the armor, we're more vulnerable, but we also have the ability to actually connect, which gets back to what you were talking earlier about, you know, but you've mentioned several times things being relational. You be a relational minister, and it's important, you know, for your sermons to be relational, and just that's an orientation. It's a manifestation of your Libra sun.
Yes. Speaking of relationality, it's like, it's always amazing to me how ideas blossom when I speak them out in conversation. When they're inside of my head, they sort of can get trapped and knock around for a long time. But when I express them either in conversation or in writing or in some way like that, it's like they just sort of unfold. like flowers to the sun. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate you accepting the invitation. And I also chose a poem.
Please read it.
Okay. I chose this poem by John O'Donohue.
Oh, so good.
And I'm going to try to read it without crying.
Cry if you need to.
Won't be the first time.
Better out than in.
That's also true. May you be blessed with good friends. May you learn to be a good friend to yourself. May you be able to journey to that place in your soul where there is great love, warmth, feeling, and forgiveness. May this change you. May it transfigure that which is negative, distant, or cold in you. May you be brought into the real passion, kinship, and affinity of belonging. May you treasure your friends. May you be good to them, and may you be there for them. May they bring you all the blessing, challenges, truth, and light that you need for your journey. May you never be isolated. May you always be in the gentle nest of belonging with your Anam Cara.
Beautiful.
Thank you for being my Anam Cara.
Thank you for being my Anam Cara for these many years and many more to come.
Correct. And many even more exciting adventures than the one.
I'm looking forward to that.
Me too. I love you so much.
I love you too. Thank you, my dear.
Yeah, thank you. Have a beautiful day.
You too. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.